Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, let me welcome you all at our panel discussion about, as our title, the challenges increasingly polarized societies are posing to politics, collaboration with the Hanns-Seidel-Foundation based in Brussels. In how far are elections polls manifestations of polarized societies? Can we attest to that in the case of Germany or the Netherlands? These are questions we might want to discuss.
So far, the Netherlands and Germany have been stable and constructive partners working alongside for an integrated and unified democratic Europe. All the more should we be aware of shifts in voters' allegiances and opinions, populist arguments and movements, and anti-European sentiments in both of our countries. The question is how to win back a partly alienated population. How do we address the problem of fragmented or even polarized societies? And where are the differences? What can we learn from each other in order to make our democracies more resilient?
So let's first go to the elections in Hesse and Bavaria. What do we see? How do you interpret the results?
So the polarization within the Christian Democratic Party has grown a lot, I think, and the Christian Democrats have a totally different image than they had in the times of Merkel, and particularly when one talks about refugees and asylum policy. It is the opposite, I think. And
if you look at European elections, these days, governments cannot necessarily expect it to be re-elected, as we all know. And in both cases, the governments were not just re-elected, but they were re-elected with an increased majority. That already says, I think, something about the fluidity, the volatility of the electorate, or the absence. In Hesse, the government, which has now been re-elected, if it's formed again between those two parties, which most people expected, has already been ruling for 10 years. But even after 10 years, people did not feel like they wanted a change, despite everything that's happened over 10 years. And in Bavaria, the coalition had also been in government for 5 years, and has also been re-elected with an increased majority. That's quite boring for students of politics. What's even more boring is that no new party has entered the parliament in either Bavaria or Hesse. All that has happened is that in Bavaria, the Liberals failed to get re-elected into parliament, and in Hesse, the Linke, or the left, has failed to be re-elected. So while in a lot of Europe we see a party system which seems to be very much in flux and new parties coming out of nowhere, and within a couple of elections making it into government or becoming the largest party here, as a result of the elections, the party system, at least as it's represented at the level of the parliament, has actually consolidated. It hasn't fragmented anymore, it has been consolidated. So that's a boring bit. No new parties, consolidation, governments re-elected. Now let's make it a little bit more interesting,
turnout.
if I may.
And a big turnout.
Yeah, and a big turnout.
That's
Everything
not
good,
much.
stability, everything we like to hear about Germany normally. If we look, however, how the parties, and you've mentioned this briefly, of the ruling coalition at the federal level are concerned, have fared in these elections, all three parties have lost. And all three parties have lost in both elections. They have lost votes. So the first thing which you see is that there is extraordinary mobility in the electorate between the federal elections from 2 years ago and what happened now.
I remember the CSU a couple of years ago in Bavaria was very worried about the rise of the AfD, and they were sort of chasing behind them, moving a lot to the right.
Well, they have a good...
But wait, at one point, they had been doing this for a few years, they lost votes, and the AfD was winning. And then suddenly, I think Nicolaus Blume was the head of the Secretary General of the CSU, and they stopped it. And he was asked in Die Zeit, I will never forget this interview, page 17, somewhere, with a little postage stamp kind of picture, so you would easily overlook it. And they asked him, so what happened? All of a sudden you are being nice about women's rights and about climate change and, reaching out to the Greens. Why did you do this? Why did you stop chasing the AfD? And he said, du kannst ein Stinktier nicht überstinken.
Well, that is...
So what is going on between those two? What about this correlation?
There's a big political science literature for how long ostracization works. I mean, for how long does it work to sort of, and that's a firewall discussion, we might have it later, which is about, the CDU and how it orients itself. That works for a certain period, and if the party is still relatively small. Once it gains a threshold, once it becomes institutionalized, once it gains representation in several parliaments, this idea of basically a strategy of ignoring does no longer work. Of course, the CSU could focus on other topics because people's interests in topics goes up and down. But this election was in the shadow of the overarching question of migration, immigration, and the state of the economies. So if you fight an election in a public opinion climate where migration dominates and the state of the economy, which worries a lot of Germans, then a strategy which basically says we're not engaging with their topic doesn't work.
Okay, I think here we have you can react as well, but here we also have a bridge to the Dutch situation. The role of the far right. We have several far right parties, of course, splinters of splinters of splinters. But at the same time, what you see, I think, in the Netherlands too, and I'm always abroad, but I try to follow it a bit. Broadly seen from abroad, there is this a consolidation of the political center as well, with Timmermans coming back, countering the fragmentation trend.
I think it's a big secret. The center has always been there.
Et voilà. Yeah, thank you. I was just about to ask you, is the center going to hold in the Netherlands too?
Many analysts, particularly in the Netherlands, thought that the electorate would go to the flanken. What is it?
To the fringes.
To the fringes.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Because the fringes were setting the tone in the debate.
The fringes are setting the tone.
But not any longer. Or are they?
So in the end, perhaps the electorate is much more true to its own principles, whereas the political parties are changing. And what we see now, to illustrate it, the CDA, the Christian Democrats in the Netherlands, will become a very small party. Probably, we don't know, because so there are two new, rather big parties in the polls, de Boer-Burgerbeweging en het Nieuw Sociaal Contract. And these parties are more or less in image and in outcome Christian Democrat. I mean, there are many Christian,
one more than
former
the other,
Christian
I would say.
Democrats.
One is more Christian Democrat than the other.
Sure,
no?
But the idea of sort of communality, many ideas of Christian Democrats are taken over by these other parties. So one could say the Christian Democrats will win the elections, but the Christian Democrat Party is diminished, more or less. So I think it's in Germany. It was always clear that the center was important, and that you will win the elections in the center. Particularly under Angela Merkel was that clear, because Merkel is of course a center figure, Scholz as well.
We're going to move on. I want to ask you, because migration has also been an issue that's been on the table for a long time.
No.
You know, we've had many elections in Europe in the past 15 years,
Yes,
which
but
were
it's
driven by
fluctuating.
migration. I want to ask Klaus now on the European elections. You know, what kind of extrapolation can you make of the results in Germany in a broader European perspective, in the light of the European elections that we will have next year in June?
I can answer very quickly, none, because we don't have a European election, but we have elections with their own dynamics in the 27 member states of the European Union. There's very little evidence that there is really a cross-country dynamic in the European elections. And we've seen very clearly in the last European elections that national dynamics outweigh any European level influences. But I think for the European elections, your best guide is the last national parliamentary election.
The word polarization is used more and more often. What is polarization, and what kind of polarization are we seeing in Europe, in politics these days? Is it really society polarizing, as some people say? Is it political parties polarizing? Hanko, what do you think?
What a difficult question. There is a big difference between the electorate, if the electorate is polarizing, or the social debates are polarizing, and then one even could ask if it's bad polarization, in that sense that a strong political debate, for example in Europe, I hope there will be next year, because there are some things at stake, climate, EU enlargement. We really could vote much more convinced next year than in the last elections, I would say, because a little bit more polarization in Europe would be very good, I think. But the problem is, of course, when this polarization leads to ignoring each other, no debate anymore, and even ignoring the government. Well, in that sense, there are some worries, I think, perhaps more in Germany than in the Netherlands, because the polarization in Germany is much more on the street. Like Pegida in 2014 started on the street, walking huge marches with many people, whereas our right radical parties never could mobilize people to demonstrate. So it's much more a political issue. Geert Wilders PVV has 2 members, Geert Wilders himself and the foundation PVV, and that's it. So there isn't even a political party, something which is impossible in Germany, but it's a typical Dutch case.
Okay.
So to
Yeah.
speak.
Klaus, there is a sociologist in Germany, Stefan Mau, who is quite a big sociologist, I think, who argues that actually there is no polarization of society, or very little, because yes, you have wokeism, and yes, you have all kinds of other phenomena, but in reality, what you see is a lot of people who still drive an SUV but eat vegan at the same time, or people who are homosexual but vote for the extreme right. So he says the politics is much more, politicians are much more polarized than the general public. Would you agree with that?
But just very briefly, I think for clarity, when we're talking about polarization, we're talking about 2 different things. They are linked, but they're analytically and empirically distinct. The first is polarization in the party system. It goes back to famous political scientist, Giovanni Sartori, who classified party system, including looking in particular at the degree of polarization. And what this basically means is two things. What is the ideological spectrum of the political parties which are represented in parliament, i.e. parties which have a relevant size? That used to be measured classically from left to right, and now you can also authoritarian versus liberal. But basically you're asking how big is the space in which parties move, how far apart are they from each other, and are the parties coalitionable with each other? That is, can they in principle think they would form a coalition? Or how many parties are in a party systems which are ostracized by the other parties, that is, parties which are not coalitionable with anybody else? And that's one understanding of polarization, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. That's party system polarization. In Germany, that is relatively low, but it has increased first with Die Linke, which is not coalitionable for the CDU and the CSU, and now with the AfD, which at the moment is not coalitionable with any of the other parties. So this party level polarization has increased. What Mao talks about, and many other people talk about, is social polarization. And again, there are various definitions.
Or the lack of it.
Or the lack of it. But this is not a sociology seminar, so we're not talking about what does society look like. At least I'm not. But I'm interested in what is called political polarization. And here a term is now regularly used in the discussion, affective polarization. Affective, not effective, affective, the effect. And what that means, and there's a lot of empirical work done on this now in European political science, what this means is how do I regard those who I think are of the same political opinion as me, and what do I think of people who I suspect may have a quite different political opinion to me. Affective polarization. How strong are my emotions to my in-group, and how strong are my emotions vis-a-vis those who I suspect that, let's say I'm a voter of the SPD, that they vote for the CDU or maybe for the AfD or for Die Linke. And there the evidence seems to be, and I bring it up here, is that on the whole, in Europe, this level of affective polarization is still relatively low in most countries. The study I have in front of me was published here. It's available in English at the Technical University Dresden a few weeks ago. The most polarizing issues are climate change and immigration. This is what people feel most strongly about when they also look at others. Why don't they agree with me on this? Italy and Greece are seen to be the most polarized in this understanding, where people have the strongest feeling, negative emotions towards those that don't agree with them. And interestingly, the Netherlands and Czechia are seen as the least polarized in this way. Very interestingly, and this might come as a surprise to you and then I stop, people on the left are more polarized than those on the right. This is what this study finds. Affective polarization is strongest amongst supporters of the left and environmental parties. I continue to read briefly. People who describe themselves as being on the left of the political spectrum are on average significantly more polarized than people who locate themselves on the right. Moreover, across Europe, voters supporting left to far left or green and environmental parties appear to be significantly more polarized than supporters of the other parties. Now, this is an interesting finding, and of course there are other studies, right? And you would find other evidence, but this was done by a very reputable institute, very recently, a comparative study. Now, what that tells us, I think, and I'll come back to Frau Schulz, who was so delighted about the 15%. What that tells us is that for in particular voters of green and environmental parties, this issue counts more than anything else, and that they feel very, very strongly about it. They feel more strongly about it than many white voters feel about immigration. Because voters on the right, according to this study, Europe-wide, are more tolerant of others' opinions. The one exception so far, and there was a study by Konrad Adenauer Foundation a couple of years ago, is Germany. In Germany, the people who see themselves as voters of the AfD, they have more effective polarization than even the green voters, of course, in the other direction. And why is that? Because in Germany, there is still a cordon sanitaire or a firewall around the AfD. Until very recently, that party was untouchable in the media, in the regional parliaments, in the federal parliaments. The question now will be whether the strategy of the cordon sanitaire or of the firewall is sustainable, in particular in the new German Länder. We will have elections next year in Thuringia, in Saxony, in Brandenburg. And what that will mean, whether that will mean that German voters and extreme voters will also become less polarized, or whether this kind of mentality, we are under siege, nobody else wants to play with us, and if nobody else wants to play with us, we certainly don't want to play with them, whether that will be maintained.
Very interesting. I understand there are lots of foreign diplomats here in the room who want to hear a little bit more about the Netherlands. So
I want to hear more about the Netherlands.
Me too, actually. Everything is in flux, or maybe nothing. Do you recognize this if you look at the Dutch situation, Hanko? Do you recognize this? It's the left being more polarized, more entrenched in its own opinions and lifestyle than the right?
What I like is I'm working at the Duitsland Institute and watching German politics, so to speak, and also watching what is happening in the Netherlands. And very often you see developments which are more or less similar and comparable, etc. And sometimes they are not comparable. And so the development of the Greens in the Netherlands is not comparable, I think, with the Greens in Germany, in that sense that they decided to cooperate with the Social Democrats into one new left-wing party under Frans Timmermans. So I would say that they are not a polarizing group. I can imagine that in Germany the Greens are very much convinced of the perhaps scientific basis of their politics. Yeah, and that is the reason why they don't understand that other parties do not agree with them, because science says that climate change should, how do you say it?
Is happening and should be stopped. Yeah.
Thanks.
So you don't see it on the left?
I don't see it
And
on the
do you
left.
see- what do you
And
see
on
on
the
the
right,
right?
it's very interesting that when Rutte declared that he would stop with his job, he shook hands with all the politicians, including Geert Wilders, and he said, I can't remember what he said exactly, but it was something like, we're old friends and it's nice.
See you again, mate.
See you again, mate. Something like that. And you never would see Olaf Scholz shaking hands with somebody of a right radical party. And that's a big difference. I think the difference is that many people in the Netherlands would say, yeah, okay, Wilders and Thierry Baudet, they're a little bit odd. And they say strange things, but they're also a part of our political culture, so they're included more or less in our culture, despite the fact that what they are saying is weird and perhaps even dangerous. Nobody would particularly not want that Thierry Baudet would have any say anywhere, But he's a curious figure and has some intellectual thoughts which are ridiculous, but okay, he's one of us. So that's a totally different style, political style, I think.
Is that polderen, political polderen?
Perhaps that's Polen in the sense that the Netherlands is a small country and everybody belongs to this country. That's a little bit the idea, perhaps. And indeed, you might be, or I might be, more critical as well. The farmers are also part of our country, so we defend them. Even the Farmers' Defense Force, which are really radical, got a lot of media attention. But they are our farmers, you know. So they belong to the Dutch culture and sort of all these curiosities in the Netherlands. You have windmills, and and that's a totally different political culture. And in my point of view, the difference is that many issues in Germany are discussed widely, and one should talk about the convictions. You should talk about what is a democratic party or not. In Anneville on Sunday, there was a huge discussion if you could call the AfD democratic or not. And people were angry about these questions. Well, this is not a discussion in the Netherlands.
Not at all.
Not at all, yeah. So that's very nice, I think, these differences in political culture, which are, on the other hand, very comparable. Another thing I think is that the AfD has changed a lot as well. AfD have had, I think, 3 phases. First, it was Eurocritical. Then it tried to be a more civil party, sort of people's party like the CDU, but more on the right. And today, it's much more an alternative party, where right extremists really have a big influence, and where there's not so much internal discussion anymore. And that's the reason why the AfD is also much more successful today, in my opinion. But all these debates which the AfD had, they had very many internal quarrels. They're not there anymore, because one might even be a little bit afraid Björn Höcke might have won with his wing within the party, and strong debates within the party are not visible anymore. They are there, of course, and I think, to be honest, also you present a lot of figures. These are very difficult things to measure, but to say that the AfD is able to present a whole story today, which they couldn't 2 years ago because there was so much internal opposition and disagreement, is a fact which is politically very important.
Klaus, a reaction, and then we throw it open.
I would disagree something, because the topic which has been gaining this enormous amount of attention in recent months is one topic that everybody in the AfD can agree on amongst its leadership. This is not about social policy, this is not about education policy or transport policy, it's not even about foreign policy, where you have very different views in the AfD, for example, when it comes to Ukraine, where there is no united view. But for whatever reason, you blame the Bild-Zeitung, others blame other, or would find other reasons for whatever reason. The key issue that the AfD is most closely identified with, namely migration, became a very important issue, not the sole issue, but a very important issue in this election. And therefore, the many fractions and the many conflicts within the AfD, I mean, in the Bavarian parliament, I mean, the last 5 years were absolute madness, but they've still managed to increase that. But it was real madness, people leaving and, all sorts of things. But this didn't matter because of migration. Their story is a very clear one. We don't want it, right? That's the end of the story, really. And that has helped to unite them. If we were talking about other issues, for example, if really the war in Ukraine had been the dominant issue, if COVID had still been the dominant issue, where there were different views in the AfD about how to react to that, then that perception of unity, of relative unity, would have looked quite different. There is a problem for the CDU. I mean, I said earlier on that the CDU managed to recover from the disastrous results it had in the last federal elections. And that shows that, that was just a totally mismanaged electoral campaign. So that the problem the CDU now has is that on the one hand, it should oppose the federal government. And it shouldn't be that difficult at the moment to oppose a federal government because a majority of Germans, I have the figures here, a big majority of Germans is dissatisfied with the federal government. And what we've seen in particular, other studies have shown, is a collapse not just in the perception of competence, but in trust. And that for politicians is often even more worrying. Competence you can regain. Regaining trust, as we all know in life, is more difficult. And there has been a collapse almost in the trust in the federal government. Why is the CDU not doing better than it is? Because it is very difficult for the leader of the CDU, Friedrich Merz, to have an opposition strategy when at the same time he's already thinking, in my mind, too much about the next federal elections and who he will want to form a coalition with. On those occasions, and you mentioned some of them, where he has tried to mobilize by polarizing and by saying controversial things, he was immediately attacked by several minister presidents who govern with the Greens, including Wüst in Germany's biggest state, North Rhine-Westphalia, who governs with the Greens, and of course Rhein, who in Hesse governs with the Greens. So there is also a problem.
They don't want to be compromised.
There's a problem in German politics that the party, which would be and is the party of the Chancellor, it's a natural party, there's a structural asymmetry towards the CSU in the German party system. There has always been since the 1950s. But that party is unable at the moment or unwilling to formulate really clear alternatives to what the federal government does. Not because it's impossible to think of alternatives, but because they are held back by the fact that they rely on the Greens in several of the important states, that the minister presidents there do not want to antagonize the Green parties which they govern. But that, of course, means that for the electorate, the clear profile of the main opposition party vis-à-vis the government is not as clear as it should be in order to mobilize. And the AfD has benefited from this. And the free voters in Bavaria have also benefited from this, because of course the free voters in Bavaria so far only compete with the CSU and the Bavarian parties, not with anybody else at the federal level.
Okay. We can go on for a long time, but I imagine you have some questions. So I think we've... It's a big discussion. There are many elements that we have touched on, many elements we were not able to touch on yet, that we keep for next time. But I, for one, have good takeaways. The center is holding. It's some politicians who are, and political parties who are strongly polarizing, which in itself is not a negative thing, not a bad thing. It doesn't need to be a bad thing. And people want to make informed choices, and many more good takeaways. So thank you all for coming and for your excellent questions and for all your interest. And see you next time, because it's becoming a tradition. Thank you.